Morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Mark Wharton, co-founder and inventor of IOTICS. I'm going to talk to you. My presentation is, are digital twins and fair digital objects the same thing? If I was an academic, I'd call it something like topological and ontological similarities between such and such, but no, they're the same thing. I'm not an academic. I work for IOTICS. So here's the question. Are digital twins and FDOs separate like that? Are they completely different? Do they overlap like this? Or bold assertion that an FDO is a subset of a digital twin? Okay, bold assertion, 9 o'clock in the morning. So let's have a look at some of the terminology that we use. Now, I want to explain a little bit about IOTICS, and I will get round to it, but we set out 10 years ago to build a semantic overlay layer across the Internet of Things. And incidentally, we thought we'd invented the digital twin, and then I talked to Erik and had one of those conversations where everybody nods all the time. It was like, oh, right, you talk about semantics and decentralization. Yes, so do we. Okay, so let's have a look then. Digital object we call digital twin, fair data point. We have a concept called IOTIC space, which is a bunch of servers which belong to you where you put your digital twins. Is that not the same thing as a fair data point? The digital object interface protocol, well, we have an IOTICS API, but we also, IOTICS is all message based because it's to do with digital twins and streaming data. So we have a message based API that you can send messages to things, and I'll show you that later because I'm going to do, with no safety net, a live demonstration. Not only that, yes! The identify resolution protocol, those kind of things, we use the W3 standard DIDs in IOTICS, so you have a DID resolver. The repository system, so somewhere underneath all your fair data objects and your semantic layer, you have a real thing. So, okay, we don't do that. That's your job, so customers own in there. And then the registry system, how do you register your FDO or your digital twin? Well, in IOTICS, we have a decentralized system where every part of that decentralized thing has its own Apache Geno instance. So you can semantically register in a decentralized network every digital twin that you have. So similarities like that. They both need metadata. Sorry, talking to the microphone, Marky. Well done. They all need metadata. And so we use the same thing, semantic, RDF, that kind of stuff. Digital twins can do real-time data. I didn't notice anybody with their... Hello, what? Oh, okay. I'm a wanderer. So, yes. Okay, so... we can do real-time data and we can do control interfaces. This is where we can tell digital twins to do something, turn down, turn up as well if you want to. The FDO, I can't remember what the IR was now. That was the identity record or something, wasn't it? And the typing, well, isn't that just more metadata? And we can all do metadata anyway, so that's fine. And also in the IOTICS digital twin, its access control rules are all done semantically. Can I look at your digital twin, yes or no? Can I follow your digital twin, yes or no? Who's allowed to, who's not allowed to? Can do that already. So identity and metadata, this is the picture that a lot of people are showing. So you've got an identifier which points to something in the real world, this is the real thing. And there's a typing system and there's some metadata records. And you might have been yesterday when I asked the question, why do you need 2 identities for that? I don't think you do, but that's just me. This is how we do metadata in IOTICS. Here's the DID. Here's a bunch of triples that describe the digital twin from that DID. You can do things like location. You can add, any triples you like. You want a digital twin of something. As long as you can put it on the right-hand side of RDF type, you've got a digital twin of that thing. So you say, show us an example where you're using this in the real world. Oh, look, universities using IOTICS to share academic data in the UK. Sheffield are running tests against their aeroplane where they collect lots and lots of sensory data, and they used to email it to each other as CSV files. So we said, stop doing that. Make a digital twin of each of your test cases. Everybody has their own separate piece in the decentralized network. You can share your digital twins with everybody else. So that project is coming to the end of this year. You'll probably hear about it because they're going to make a song and dance about it when they get it going. But sorry, am I missing something? Isn't that what FDOs are all about? Sharing academic data between universities. Oh, look, we're already doing it. These are the selective data sharing rules inside IOTICS. This is at the semantic level. This is at the virtual level as well, not at the actual. You can put yet more rules if you want against the final collection of your data. But this is, can my twin talk to your twin rules? And I think that's an old version, and we're going to get a new version which is even more complicated coming up soon, but more granular permissions. And the permissions, as I said, all done via the semantics. Demonstration. Oh, okay. let's have a go. I've prepared with a AV friend at the back, so I'm going to have to go to the back of the room. He's got a microphone for me. So everybody cross your fingers for me, because this is live demos in front of large groups of people. Oh, I see. In front of a large group of people. So, oh, actually, tell you what. Sorry, my bad. Can we go back to? I ought to describe the demo first, otherwise you won't understand it. I should know my own slides really by now. Oh, there we go. Stupid thing. Right, can you hear me from the back? Yes, you can. Okay, good. Right, so the first thing here, we've got a picture of a cat, obviously, because it's the internet. It's all about pictures of cats on a web server. So the first thing we do is we get ourselves an Arctic space or a fair data space, and we create a digital twin. The digital twin says, I'm a picture of a cat. There we are. It tells you it's an Arctic's digital twin. It says it's a DCAT distribution, and it's an image, and there's the URL of the image, and it's Connell, who's one of our developers' cat. There we go. And it even tells you what the species of cat is. So then, what happens then? Somebody else in another Arctic space, this could be a digital twin of the researcher or a person, says, hey, I'm looking for a picture of a cat. And that gets sent across the whole network. And it says, hey, everybody, has anybody got a picture of a cat? And the people over here go, I have a twin of a picture of a cat. And then this one says, can I have a link? And it goes, yeah, sure, here you are. Here's a link to it. And it shoves a JWT token on the end of it to a one-time URL. This one says, fine, I'll have that link very much. Thanks very much. There we go, live demo. Here we go. So, can you just hold that for me? Forgive me for doing it this is VS Code. Sorry, everybody, it's a command line demo. But on the left-hand side is the requester. Yeah, so I'm going to run the requester. And so the run requester is going to start off, and it's going to go, I'm making a DID, and then it should create a digital twin. And while that's going on the other side, I'll create the digital twin of the thing that's got it. Oh, stupid. Hang on, run out of network, just a second. Oh, you get this thing set up and then they bite you. Just wait a second while I connect to my phone. I'm gonna run out of time. I'm gonna get told off, aren't I? Come on. Where has it gone? There we go. Right, let's try with the internet turned on this time. Oh, it's going to go super slow. Okay, we're good. Here we go. Let's try again. Here we go. So this one's going to create the left-hand side of the picture on the PowerPoint. This is the person who wants it. This is the person who has it. And we were talking about autonomous agent systems. There we are, people. There are 2 autonomous agents doing their thing. So with any luck, we should see yes, 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 and yes. Good. So I'm going to go onto a browser now. and I'm going to fetch localhost, this one here. So this is the get which triggers the search. So it hit this get. Notice it says there, and it comes back and it says, here I've found localhost cat JPEG, which I can take out of there, put into there, fetch that URL with the JWT token, and hey presto, a picture of a cat. If you don't believe me, I can take the JWT token out, and it says, you can't have the picture of the cat. So can I go back up front now? How am I doing for time, Mr. Timer?
You're through your normal time. We're in question time.
We're in question time, right, okay, any questions?
Why does it work?
Hello. Oh yeah, Mike's behind you, sorry, yes. I'll stand here. Hello, Lewis. Oh, okay, sorry. Oh, even less time for questions now, good, haha.
In order to answer the questions, if digital twin is the same as fed digital object or a part of it or a type of it, we need definitions of both, right? Yeah. What do you understand as digital twin, and what you are comparing as a definition of the FDO? From my personal perspective, I think that we even wrote a paper about that. Digital twin is a specific type of digital object with specific characteristics, because we adopted the general definition of digital twin. That's a set of properties and values that depict as current as possible the state of real objects for some purpose like simulation and manipulation and so forth. So in this sense, it's a container, it's a data set that's a container of a lot of other data types. Parts of other data sets can be distributed, can be centralized, but it's a type of digital object.
Yes, well, I agree. It's about definitions, and there are as many definitions of digital twin as there are people who make definitions of digital twins, it seems. The Arctic's definition is, it's a bunch of metadata which describes a thing, possibly a real thing like a sensor or a heating or ventilation system in the real world. Maybe not. Maybe it describes an algorithm or a data set. But anyway, it's a bunch of metadata describes it. You're allowed to have a feed or feeds of data which are real time. So I'm this hot, my fan speed is this. And you can also have a control interface which says turn yourself down or up. So a subset of that for me is almost identical to a fair digital object. It's a bunch of metadata which describes a real thing. So.
I think it's tempting to give an answer to you, is it the same or not? But I would first ask you, do you have documentation? Since it's about specifications, right? You have to really compare, as Louis indicated, what are the specifications? We discussed that, and Christophe will have a talk about similar things. And it comes close. I agree with you.
Yeah.
You need to check the specifications. So do you have documentation about that?
Well, well, I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure, because we've built a system which is generically adaptable using semantics.
Okay, so let's start this interaction.
Yeah, sure, fine. Okay, I'm going to stop.
That's a nice bridge.
So, we'll start the timer. Yeah. Can I have my slides? So what I'm going to tell you is about a project proposal which we sent to the ministry, German ministry, and we hope still to get funded. Crowd of people discussing this, and when well, that should be an animation, but it's a bit distorted. So it should be an indication of the global data space which is emerging, and for sure it will not be round. It will be a very strange thing, but for sure it is big, and there are so many sources. If you look to IoT or whatsoever, there are so many sources. So we get a huge and big data space. And the question is then, what happens? How can you work in this huge data space? And we all know if we want, that's about fair, if we want to get machines into the game, we need to be exact in the descriptions. And how to organize this big thing, and what should we do when something new, a collection, small collection, is entering this world? So we are discussing this, and we want to get money for a project which I briefly describe here. So this is all known. We know what we are doing currently. We did it a lot in my former institute to find people who have data about the brain, which we could use, and that's an awful lot of work, as we all know. So this will not go on like this if we think of this integrated data space where we can search in, look in. So for what we are doing, and we want to simulate that space, of course, since there is no real space for us which we can use. So simulate that space, use metadata, schemas which are out there from different research infrastructure, so inspired by what is out there from big communities. And so let's assume for a moment, and it's not given, that we have good metadata, rich metadata, that the metadata is freely available, and that big data monopolies will be broken at that time, so that you have, at a certain moment, access to really the huge data which is out there, and of course that you have trusted resource providers. There's one thing, and that goes back to what Mark just said, in fact, and he seems to have solved it in a certain environment. There's one thing which, of course, which would not be, we call it a no-go. If you think that you do a search in such a big room, you get some results. The agent gets some results, maybe 1,000, and then the agent finds out that at the end that there's no access to anything. Since for the usage you want to do it, you can't use these results which you get. That would be very inefficient. So we have to think about how to enter roles and usages. I'm discussing this with the industry people in Germany who are who are using these terms in their reference architectures, but I found out that in fact, and they are very honest about this, there's no attempt really to standardize these things, right? Roles and usage in the broad. So they have it in their reference architecture, but they really didn't implement it. But I saw from the previous speaker, from Mark, that he has something like this, like roles in his scenario already. Well, anyhow, so we must have some. So I said we will simulate data. We must have some idea about how to formulate data, so there will be common metadata, and you know this, there will be a stack of different types of metadata. So we will simulate something based on good examples from big research infrastructures. Of course, we will have some with this space. So what we want is to use a weighted facet vector, and there maybe is not just one, there will be several. Use it to have a pre-clustering of the space by self-organizing algorithms, of course, and then of course also create use top-down ideas, but also bottom-up ideas. And what you finally get, of course, when you apply this, you will get a kind of hierarchy of clusters and subclusters. So that's the stuff we want to simulate and work on. What else is important? Of course, there are a couple of aspects which we all know, I guess. So each fair digital objects will be can be part of different clusters. what else? Oh yeah, when you ingest a new, so if you apply self-organizing algorithms, you get a new a set of FDOs, a collection of FDOs, and several of them, you certainly will start blurring the clusters. If you have algorithms that enter them into certain clusters, you will certainly start blurring these clusters. So from time to time, you have to do this top-down restructuring again and again. And that should happen, of course, in offline. So reorganizing these yep. So, and why do we this? Why do we do this all? And why do we look at FDOs? Well, I already mentioned that we will simulate this space, since there's no realistic space which we could use. So there are, of course, a lot of questions which are open, and when I'm staying here, I'm basically crying for advice, help. So we have some good people from AI in there, but it's certainly certain open questions. So what are suitable weighted representations to do this clustering, to come to these hierarchies of clusters? How to mix top-down and bottom-up procedures to come to these set of clusters. Yes, and of course there's growing knowledge in this graph, so people will do something, brokers will do something, how to add all this knowledge into such clusters, since you will, if brokers did some mapping or so, you want to use that, how to integrate this into this world. And why do we use FDOs? Well, simply since FDOs contain all the information which you need, so they are bound, as we say. The metadata is bound, the rights which we will use, simulate also, are bound, the usages are bound. So that's why we will use FDOs. That's it. So open for comments. I'm excellent in time, I see.
Yeah.
Yes.
Questions, please.
Sorry. Why do you imagine that you'll need AI to reconfigure the GIDS? Because won't people configure it as and when they need to?
Sorry?
Won't people do it? Why do you think you need an AI to reorganize it? Surely clusters of people will do it instead.
Well, AI machines are, I mean, if you think about self-organizing algorithms, these are AI algorithms, if you want. That's why I use the term AI. And there are different classes of such algorithms, and we will use some. And we have to see which kind of algorithms work best on this huge data space. Right, so that's why I'm saying AI. So the brokers are, so you need to apply machines or use machines to sort on this huge space, and based on some initial weighted, I call it facet. You will initialize the self-cluster, this self-organization machinery to come to these clusters, and you will not start only with one organization. You will start certainly with a few organizations. So one basic principle, if you think about this hierarchy, could be what are the usage rights, right? Or the other one could be, which is the more expected, is what is the discipline? Is it about brain research? Is it about the climate? Whatever. So you have these kind of, I call that faceted vectors, you know, where you have some principles and you use algorithms to organize these to organize this space according to these priority principles.
Like a super index then, in that case?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Well, you could call it, yes. Yeah.
More questions?
Hi, Peter. When you mentioned that the metadata should be openly available, do you mean all types of metadata, or just the base one? Because some more specific types of metadata may be already sensitive enough, right?
Yeah. So, so Luis, you're right. So we have that in our we had that in our institute itself ourselves. So we had the problem that some metadata was closed by our researchers, and other metadata was open. Well, if it's closed, it's just another resource, right? So it's a bit sequence which you add. So in this simulation, we just say it's open, to make it simple. But it doesn't really make it really doesn't make a point, since the self-organization will start from more generic, say, classification. How do you say classification? Classifiers? No, what? So like, what is it, the research discipline, right? And you will have such generic, probably at the beginning, such generic categories to come to these basic principles at the highest hierarchical level.
You still have time? You there?
Thank you very much for your talk. The data space you're describing very much to me sounds like the data space needed for the monitoring framework of post-2020 global biodiversity monitoring of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there's because you're mentioning about rights and uses and access, there's quite a lot of discussion about how to access data and information. So I was wondering if you have contacts there.
Well, it would be good to exchange emails. I mean, I know Dimitris and a few other guys from your discipline, but let's sit together. And so, of course, we will simulate data, but if we can get easily realistic metadata to incorporate, we will do. You know, if it makes sense, right? So we have to check that. Yeah.
One last question.
Just an observation, not a question. Your slide on the 4 level of metadata suddenly clarified a lot to me. So maybe something similar should be, in my opinion, incorporated in the big schema, because if you remember yesterday, it was not clear for me the difference between metadata and FDO profile. So maybe a note, something that explain these various level of metadata could, in my opinion, could be useful for clarifying the FDO. Thanks.
Thank you, Mario. So what we will do, so as I said, we will have a look to some well-defined metadata schemas. So I know from my old community, Clarin, we have done a lot of work and we have done a nice work. So we will take that one. We might also take a few others when we have to look into this, and from other disciplines, and then figure out, you know, what is common. So it's a bit of hard work. What is common? Since we need to have these generic, we need to have a notion of what is generic metadata, which you could say kind of Dublin core stuff also. But we have to look into this. What is more generic? So discipline is very generic, and what is more detailed, right? And we need to come to a how to say, classification of these metadata categories which people are using, which is a bit of hard work comparing these schemas to have a bit of, how to say, grounding for the simulation. Otherwise, we would just simulate something which doesn't make sense or so. So we have to look into concrete metadata sets to have a base, a ground under the feet, so that we are not just flying somewhere. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a bit of work. Yep.
According to my agenda, Hans-Günther Döbereiner. Take the mic.
Eins, one. Okay, good, great. I'm ready to go. Sorry.
I will signal you the time.
Oh, I sit down. No, no. Oh, okay, there you go. Good morning. I'm glad that the first speaker was similarly unprepared than I, so I'm not so strangely coming over. Okay, so I am talking about the nature of information. What I mean is that the way the data is structured depends on the discipline, and even the questions the discipline is asking depends on the discipline. So there's kind of a dual hierarchy we have, and the meaning that that nature is mirrored by the research disciplines, and that the whole two systems are hierarchically ordered. And FDOs can help to organize that. So first of all, you go from data to fair data. Then, because they are fair, you will be able to globally percolate it. Then you have the globally integrated space, and then the second usage of FDOs is to organize that space, fuse them to higher ordered to higher clusters, which have less symmetry than the ones below, and the whole thing is going to give us the knowledge, and at the very upper end are disciplines like philosophy. That was it in a quick. So I go. How do I go forward? This one?
I think this one. It seems to be a...
Can sure.
Do it like this.
Yeah.
Oh, I was the wrong way, right? Okay. So this is the first usage that's clear to us. Second usage are the connected FDOs working, and the first speaker said it, like autonomous agents, and the task is to organize that space, organize it, and after you have organized it and you've gone away for some time, or somebody else is coming, that somebody else is finding it again. So where this is coming from, so we start from nature. There's this classical paper from 1972 by Anderson, More is Different. And here already he notices that there are hierarchical levels of nature, and if you look around, you see this. And here are and these hierarchical levels of nature create disciplines. And he's going from solid state physics, chemistry, molecular biology, cell biology, psychology, social sciences. And the one below is sort of the molecular biology is controlling cell biology, right? And solid state many body physics is controlled by elementary particle physics. So there's always a level which has constituents, and the level itself makes a emergent transition into a higher level, in a nutshell, right? So you really have a dual hierarchy, which what you still have to understand why there are actually these levels in nature, which actually science hasn't understood, really. I mean, there are lots of ideas, but there's no general theory going from particle physics to the organization of your mind, right? Which is nothing else than a complex physical system. So here you see it. You really start with elementary particle. So this is realm of physics. Then you take and two levels, right? Elementary particles, nuclei. Then you go to simple chemistry more complicated chemistry, organic chemistry, even more complicated chemistry to polymer physics, but then it gets easier again because you realize, there's these effective objects, polymers, and physics says, okay, we can actually exactly treat that. And you go further, you have more complicated polymers like DNA and proteins, and you start to build cells, organelles, and of course there's a big jump because we need to understand how life is coming about. So there are and it's going further. These cells are ordering into multicellular bodies. The multicellular creatures don't have neural systems. The neural system gets simple animals, more complicated animals, and so further, and you end up with the human, and then the important point to grasp, and then that's the point. And here's a gap, because suddenly you jump from the organization of matter to the organization of your thoughts. But your thoughts are nothing else than represented in neural correlations, only that you perceive it differently because you are conscious. And I'm not saying I'm explaining all this, but I'm telling you all these things are linked together, and not within a year and not within 10 years, but within the next few decades, if we are good, and if you are not so good, maybe within the century, we will, I'm pretty sure, understand all this, how this is all connected in detail. Right, so these papers, important, very good insight when you read it. When you read it, is Höhl's paper on hierarchical emergence, and the point is, what the theory of hierarchical emergence is saying, that there are, for each level of theory, there are effective objects between the causality is maximal. And these are the objects which build, the levels build up in nature, and because the causality is maximal, that's the one you're talking about in the respective science. Okay, so here you have it all. You start with data, you're making yourself a universal standard, then you get the FDO. Because you have the FDO, you are able to percolate all your data and still keep track where everything is after the percolation. And if it's percolated, you find it again because this you have these methods Peter just told you about. Then in a series of causal emergence, you get to the dual hierarchy of nature, which is basically mapped by the knowledge. So in the wisdom space, so to speak, there are also levels, right? I mean, you can understand things on different levels. There are psychology is not so complicated than philosophy in terms of, in terms of structural things, right? I mean, levels of thoughts. Okay, so basically, from a physics side, the physics is from the mainstream of physics is sort of still stuck. No, I wouldn't say stuck. It's still in syntactic. It's talking about syntactic information, which is order. So physicists thinks about order as in entropy. Okay, theory of information transfer by Turing doesn't tell you anything about the meaning of the message. But the meaning of the message is it's all about. And so you have these two chumps, and I probably have to stop there, and let me finish this. So you have the natural. You have the natural sciences, and as soon as you go to life sciences, you have something, like function popping up. Okay, so there's this function doesn't exist in physics. There's nothing. There's not a physics equation. Doesn't tell you what the function is. With a hammer, you can put a nail in the wall. There's no physics equation giving you that insight in writing or as numbers. A lot of functions create meaning, and if you take a lot of different meanings on different levels, you get knowledge. So what I'm telling you, there's all this hierarchical structuring. I know I'm trying to put something very complicated in 10 minutes. I'm saying my last sentence. So the point is, because fair digital objects are so very well structured that you can fuse them and keep track of what's happening before and can define symmetries, and in fact fair digital objects are homologs to mathematical categories, which opens an enormous field, and you can't read the unfortunate thing, you can't read their books because it's higher algebra. So it's going to take a very long time before all these things can be put to use. But I think you can see the path from the very simple data to the very structured our mind. The wisdom in all these fields is just percolated, and because each field is so complicated, there's hardly any interaction between them. And fair digital objects, to my belief, will change that, because it will work together with AI and create the tools so that different disciplines can talk to each other, and that's the key: talking to each other in a transdisciplinary way between different disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Still time.
Peter, so Hans-Günther, when I understand you, so thanks for your talk. When I understand you correctly, good way to structure the space according, well, that's how to say, according to what you explained about the sciences and the hierarchy of sciences, or what you. So you see that as a help to organize the data space.
Right,
Is that
exactly.
correct?
And the beautiful thing is, it's the same technology. It's the same technology, which giving you the basic standard, which is the very low thing, just above the TCP system, but you can also structure it right through to the higher level, and because of that, you will have basically immediate. You have sort of what we call, I guess, transfer from infrastructural work and basal science into the markets, right? I mean, you will get very quickly things you can sell and make money with, which will feed back on developing of the system. And the most important thing is, because when we have the same standard of all these disciplines, then you can talk much easier to each other. And it basically, it's not only about transferring the data. It's really a socio-epistemic system. So the people and the technology build a sort of a scientific system which develops and feeds back onto each other. Because the knowledge gets developed, because of the technology, people understand it better. They can build better tools, and that circle goes on. And I believe we are now at the very brink of getting into that enormously exciting and very dangerous time. So we need to think about what we should not do. Actually, it was very well said yesterday. Yeah. There's a lot of things we shouldn't do.
Okay.
For instance.
Thank you. Thank you. Next speaker, Christophe, I think. Right.
I'll have a talk, yes. I'll wonder, yes, because I need to look at what I'm saying. So great talk. I'm afraid I'm going to bring the level much more to the bits and bytes, so this is not going to be as inspirational. But I figured after yesterday's talk from Bob, he actually explained that first slide, so I can just summarize, why I'm talking about DOIP. I mean, we talked about it before, but why is it that it seems like a good fit? Well, they come from the same basic ideas. The idea that digital objects could be a way to represent information expressed in digital form around the net, and so what are these things? How do they behave? The DOIP takes a particular approach, which is let's cut out everything that is application based and keep it very generic, so it can be used in any circumstance that you can think of. So you won't see any, convenient metadata types or things of that nature, because that's for the next level. And the FDO is exactly doing that. It's defining the next layer on top of DOIP, such as metadata, taxonomies, types. Typography is a term that I use, but the DOIP talks about it. It has some framework for it, but it's not actually developing types that the FDO would be using. So a general idea of what DOIP is, within the digital object architecture, there's this notion of resolvers for IDs and then access for digital object. And so in this whole space, DOIP represents really the interface to the digital objects and what you can do with that. So we'll go into a little bit of detail, a little bit of description, because I use these terms. I call it DOIP service, a service that speaks DOIP, and the DOIP client, a client that speaks DOIP, so that makes sense. One thing to wrap your head around is that DOIP services are themselves digital objects. So it's not just giving you a service. You can talk to it and figure out, what this particular service can do for you. The basic mode of interaction of DOIP, and I think this may sound simple, but this is the key. You interact with digital objects using identifiers that are themselves digital objects. And so it sort of turtles all the way down, but it actually works. So the idea is that you target the object that you want using an operation that itself is described as a digital object, and you identify yourself as a digital object. So everything is self-referential to a certain degree, and everything can be you can drill into it to figure out what are you. Can I glean something about you, some aspects or some behaviors that help me evaluate your requests? So with this idea of identifiers for referencing operations, for instance, is the way that you add extensibility. Because I can create digital objects, and they can be operations that then a DOIP service can use to operate on a particular digital object. So typical, DOIP services that you can think of, you'd have a digital object repository, you'd have what I call a digital object registry, which is more for search purposes. But a digital object can be anything. It could be a sensor, it could be, a piece of paper on the table, it could be a database. The one good thing about it is that you can ask for it to tell you, so what are you? What can I do with you? And so digital object services can be as similar to each other as you can think of in a particular space, but they could be just as different as individuals in the street. So a little bit of grounding, what we talk about a digital object, what do we have in mind? So definitely we have in mind something that has an identifier, something that has a type. I think we all agree, whether it's in the DOIP layer or in the FDO layer, digital objects have to have a basic way to express what they are about. And whether this type is, whether you can have polymorphic objects or not, that's up to you to decide. There's nothing really particularly at DOIP level that prevents you from saying that. We all agree that attributes are a simple way to have content. It's not the only way, but it's a good way if you're trying to interact with things in a very generic manner. Then the other thing about DOIP, which is, let's say, different than handle records, is that you have to have what we call things that are too big to just resolve. So if you have a terabyte stream, you want to be able to stream those bits. You don't want to have to download the whole thing to figure out what to do with it. So there's this notion of an element which has its own, which is in its own container within an object, if you will. And that really is the difference. So you could, by looking at this, you could say, oh, well, a handle is a digital object? And the answer to that I would give you is yes. And then the difference is, what's the difference between resolving and accessing? And there's a little bit of difference, but that probably, you know, is a discussion of itself. So the basic protocols, like most protocol, you have a request and you have a response. And this currently in the DOIP version 2.0 takes place over a TLS connection. And you can use the X509 certificates to validate both ends if need be, or you can do it within the request itself and the response. Typical request, so by now you would get the idea that you'd have a client ID, a target ID, and an operation ID. And the attributes are something that's specific to the operation. So if you have operations that need parameters, you can specify them and so forth. So if you create new operations, you can say this operation requires these parameters, and you would be able to specify them within the request, and you can provide authentication information and also have an input stream if you really want to, for instance, deposit something. Just a little detail, request ID is just so that you can send requests asynchronously and then get the response and sort them back out as they come out. The response, pretty straightforward. You get a status, the attributes that would be commensurate to the operation that you requested, and then an output. Now, it's the current DOIP version 2.0 had to provide some basic serialization that people could use, but it doesn't mean that it's restricted to that. And there are different versions of DOIP at the moment that use HTTP rather than TLS. And the protocol itself, and this does not, I'm not talking about this at the moment, but the way you make a reference to a DIP service would provide, if you provide an identifier to it, it would give you a structure describing what the information, the service information is, and you could actually name the protocol that you have. So you could say this is DOIP, and this is using this particular serialization and this transport protocol. So while we had to provide a default serialization, a default protocol so people could implement it, you could definitely do this using different protocols. And Cordura uses JSON over HTTP. Some people in China are using UDP and some binary serialization because of efficiency purposes. So just something to put in the back of your mind. Ooh, that was different. All right, so a couple things about these operations. So in the standard, we have a default set of operation. The hello operation is just to try to find out if you don't know what the service is, you can ask it, so what are you? The typical thing, just like in IMAP, it's the same idea. One that's more interesting is list operation. And this is this idea that if you go to a digital object that you're not familiar with, the first thing you could say is, so what can you do? And you get a list of operations that that particular object can perform. So think about Mark's presentation with these digital twins. You could go to the digital twin and say, so what sort of interface do you have? So if you didn't know, of course, if you don't know the interface, a lot of good that's going to do you. But it's neither here nor there. But you can imagine having totally dynamic systems where you don't know what you're interacting with, but you have a sense of what these types are and whether you can do anything with them. The other ones are, what I would call the standard CRUD operation. But then there's this last one, which is interesting, is this notion of searches. So intrinsically to the digital object architecture, there's notion that you have to be able to search for digital objects. And then we provide a standard way to say, here, the digital object registry, search yourself to tell me, give me the list of all objects that have these particular fields in it. So clearly, we think that this is very important. And I'd like to, emphasize this notion that digital object services can be registries by default. And it also, so it means that you can create registries of your own as DOIP services, and voila, you may have interoperable search. There's much more to that, of course, but this notion of being able to search digital objects is absolutely key. Extended operation, I mentioned it before, and I'd just like to emphasize them again. we don't know, and this is why the protocol remains so simple, we don't know how people want to interact with their objects. And there are lots of reasons for creating different operations to interact with different systems. If you want to talk to your database using DOIP, you can imagine the set of operations that would let you do that. If you want to talk to an IoT devices, again, there are a bunch of operations, some of which might already be standardized that you could reuse in this case to interact with IoT devices. So we want people to be able to create their own operations to solve their own problems and be able to interact with their services as they need be. Now, of course, there's this caveat which I say here is that, well, somebody has to implement them. And you know, whether you talk about no-bots, mobile code, or just server-side implementation, the key is if you advertise that your object can implement a particular operation, you'd have to have a way to verify that it does implement this operation according to the spec. And so you get into the same sort of model that the IoT community is doing, where you define IoT devices and then you have a standard interface where you can test to make sure that you're actually compatible to that standard. Now, these operations can be used in different things. So you can imagine having discrete elements in your object of a given type and use these operations to interact with that type of data element. Or you could have operations that deal with the overall object itself, where you may want to abstract the particular elements that you have. For instance, for security purposes, you can't actually see what the bits are, but you can ask a method, say, give me the document and the latest version, and you'll get it back. You could use operations as access control. And this is actually one of the ways you can extend the access control of digital objects, is by getting to an object and we'd say, well, the only thing I can give you is an operation for negotiating access. It could be something like proof of work or some signatures ad hoc. So one of the way we extend security or access control is through this operational model. So, you know, clearly there's a lot of commonality, and the FDO and DOIP you know, mesh well together. You know, a couple things like the encapsulation of data and metadata. Somebody made a point yesterday that it's important not to always say that this encapsulation has to be, you know, by reference or by instance. It's up to you to decide. There's this notion of digital object type and FDO type that are very much similar. In the case of DOIP, we provide some ideas about how to tie operations to digital object types. And finally, one point with the digital object DOIP does not require you to use, you know, DOIRP or the handle system or DOs. You just need some way to resolve an ID into a structure that gives you a hookup point to the DOIP itself. Yeah. So I think I talked about some of these, but I'd rather have some questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Time for one question, I think, or maybe two. If it's a short one. Yes, please, Mark.
Yeah. So great. I really like this. It looks like we're all inventing the same wheel at the moment. Oh, okay. We're going to play that game, are we? How do you find the endpoints where you can do the search? Because one of the things, sorry, talk about IOTICS, is you join a decentralized network, so you know who's there. How do you know who's there in this scheme?
Right. So I would sort of punt on that and say, at my level, that's below my, it's above my problem. but right. So no. So the service access points are the same thing. So digital object services and registries are typed objects. So you could search a space. Now, of course, how did you get that space? Well, let's say you have a Google-like services where you've actually aggregated a bunch of search objects, and then you could search for those based on, you know, what it is that they cover. And that would give you a list of digital objects, which you would then resolve and give you the access points to those particular things. Now, you know, you could say, well, that's a lot of resolution, but, you know, your typical client will resolve them once, and then you'd maintain a table. And the nice thing about it is that the references could have signatures and certificates that you could use to validate or, you know, perform some filtering that, you know, matters to you. So, yeah, we're not, I would say, some assembly required, but the you know, how you aggregate your space is, Peter had talked about, how this space is aggregated is not up to us to determine. So we just want to give, as much, rope for you to hang yourself with, hopefully very efficiently.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker, Erik Schultes.
Great, thank you, Daan. So the slides will come up. So really nice parallels here between what I would like to talk to you about today and the presentation we just saw and Mark's earlier presentation. I've seen in multiple places a reference to the anatomy of a nanopublication or the anatomy of an FDO. So in fact, the thing I'd like to showcase today is in work that we've done that was not planned to really be a comparative analysis between different object systems like this. But we did, I think, kind of surprisingly to ourselves, discover that there was a close similarity to the nanopublications we were working with and the features of an FDO system. And then I think even lately we'd be willing to make the argument now that we've created some nanopublications that are bona fide examples of FDOF. And appropriately enough, we can talk about comparative anatomy here at the Naturalis, where there's people who do this for a living, right? So starting out with the paper that Christophe referenced at the top of his talk, there's this idea of digital object services going back to 1995, and separating out for the biologists. I like to be very explicit about separating out kind of the structure of the digital object itself. So there is some object, it has an identifier and maybe some other attributes, schematized, and then there's the protocols or the services that act on that schema. Over time, FAIR came about, and Luis has done a lot of work to try and reconcile some of these ideas from FAIR into the digital object architecture. And of course, there's a lot of interesting work going on these days with that. At the same time, or let's say, overlapping in time, completely independently, I think, more, I don't think there was crossover, at least not in my own sphere until recently, but there was a development of this idea of a nanopublication. I think that started with Bauer and Mons. It certainly started in a biomedical context, but then this was the first publication that I'm aware of where Paul Groth and Andrew Gibson and Jan Veltrop tried to lay out this first attempt to schematize a nanopublication. A few years later, working with a team here at the Leiden University Medical Center, we ended up publishing tens of millions of nanopublications that were annotating functional elements in the mammalian genome. So I think that was the first example of actually applying the nanopublications to real data. And we've been able to do interesting analyses with those nanopublications and other data sets like the Leiden Open Variation Database. And then again, over subsequent years, we see that there are services that have grown up, I think driven primarily by Tobias, but and others, services that are allowing us to do interesting things with nanopublications. And in fact, there's NanoBench, which is a very nice tool whereby you can create nanopublications based on templates, existing templates that have been defined for different nanopublication types. And I think Luis alluded to this yesterday in his presentation, that we could do somewhat the same thing for FDOs. Okay, so that's background. There are these two parallel universes. There's digital objects and FAIR digital objects, and there is nanopublications. I'm going to go to a use case now. We've been working in the Go FAIR Foundation to try and find ways to catalyze convergence on FAIR implementations. Part of this is what we call the FAIR implementation profile. And this is simply asking communities of practice to define themselves as an implementation community. And then for each of the FAIR principles, give us a list of the technology choices that you have used to implement each of those FAIR principles. That whole list is what we call a FAIR implementation profile. And what we really wanted in this was to move away from kind of free text spreadsheet exercises. We wanted machine actionable FAIR implementation profiles. And so to do that, we borrowed Nanopublications. So we have a tool now called the FIP Wizard with NanoBench integrated into that. And we have Nanopublication types for each of the different FAIR enabling resources that correspond to different FAIR principles. So you can author Nanopublications in the wizard if you need to, but you can reuse Nanopublications that others may have created before you that are relevant. So it's a platform where we can start working with Nanopublications. And we immediately began to see, even for people who might not be so aware of digital object approaches, that there was something magical about this process of being able to encapsulate and publish machine actionable descriptions that were then shareable and appeared immediately in drop-down menus and other things. This is an initial model that we had for FAIR enabling resource Nanopublication. So we have essentially the digital object or the resource. It has an identifier. We have metadata about that FAIR enabling resource. It has an identifier, and we can point to a location if you actually want to get that resource. Over time, we felt we had to elaborate this model because, for example, we wanted to bring in Nanopublications minted by someone else into an appropriate question in our FIP questionnaire so that people could see it in the drop-down menu. So we needed to specify a type of FAIR enabling resource. And there was quite some effort that was put into that. This is a typing that we have developed just for the sake of the FAIR implementation profile. If we draw this in the Nanopublication schema, there's the resource. Its reference is part of the assertion, as is the location and the type, and that type is coming from this little ontology we made. The provenance of the Nanopublication has an author, and later on when we were working on the type, we were pointing to the metadata schema for that type, and that we located that in the publication info. And there's a trustee URI that guarantees some authentication. And all of this we would take as the metadata with the Nanopublication URI as a description of that FAIR enabling resource. What we started to realize after we had done this was that, in fact, we were working with components that were mappable onto the model that Luis has proposed. And we've put quite some time now into trying to analyze this in detail. In the case of the FDO, there might be, in the future, some kind of type registry that could replace our little ontology. So the conclusions from this that I'd like to share, this was, again, kind of, these were unexpected results that came to us. The light bulb went off like, hey, I think we're doing FDOs already. There's something that comes to a very close approximation to FDOs. So FDOs and digital objects, I would say, were developed independently from, but with many philosophical parallels to Nanopublications. So also a commitment to a very decentralized approach. And this is, in a way, convergence, and I would say not in the Peter Wittenberg sense or the FAIR convergence. This is really like in the biology sense. This is just two evolutionary trends that were independent that came together. Nanopublications can be instances of the FDO framework. I think we've proven that to ourselves with the example of the FAIR enabling resource. Nanopublications can make assertions also about non-digital things. I put this in because, it's something that we like to do with Nanopublications a lot, but that was a comment that came up yesterday when we were talking about FDOs. Are we really referring only to digital objects? The Nanopublication ecosystem is, I think, like maybe other emerging systems now, relatively mature. There's hosting real data now for the better part of a decade. There's hundreds of millions of nanopublications out there from all kinds of different disciplines, and there's a lot of services and a growing number of services to service them. One comment on this idea of trying to find a higher level abstraction in which to talk about these things. And again, this kind of came up when we were just trying to resolve, are we working with FDOs or nanopubs? To me, more and more, it looked like we had objects, for sure, and we were trying to wrap them in some kind of machine actionable container. We were trying to make an ordinary object machine actionable by adding identifiers and other attributes, and then having services that run them. So there's a nanopublication spec. There is an FDO, or potentially FDO spec. That means that there can be many implementations to these specifications. And the question was, if we have a nanopublication that's behaving as an FDO, is it an FDO? Or can we say it's a nanopublication implementation of an FDO? So, and then also I think digital twin now, if you throw that in as a third overlapping term, lately we've been using in the group this idea of machine actionable units of information as a kind of a higher level abstraction. Even kind of stepping away from the word object. And then the question is, so we have this term, and I think it actually factored in a little bit to the Leiden Declaration that you'll see tomorrow as well. So what's next? We would like to kind of make a presentation to really clarify the relations between nanopubs and the FDO framework. And I think, we see all kinds of opportunities now for kind of extending this to other object types. But the first step will be in a project that's already launched by iOS Press and the Go Fair Foundation, and now we're co-developing as well with CodeData. That was a recent decision that is very nice to present here. But the idea is that we want to extend the FAIR enabling resources nanopublication that we have crafted for the sake of the FIP Wizard into something more general, a FAIR supporting resource that we would like to present in a publication platform called FAIR Connect. And so this is, in a sense, a kind of a new journal through iOS Press, but we want to feature metadata about articles and about resources using nanopublications. So we're kind of building up a space of nanopublications in which we can begin to analyze data stewardship and FAIR implementation profiles, et cetera. So thank you.
Thank you, Erik. Time for one pressing question, maybe 1.5. Yeah. Could somebody give that gentleman a...
Less than a question than a remark.
Okay.
I think I'm extremely flabbergasted, excited that the idea which has been put forward is so general that we have this biological phenomenon of convergent evolution. And so I love what you guys do, and I'm so excited that it's basically the same thing, and then we can go forward together and do this. So, this is really, I think it's a pivotal moment, because you really see things going together. That's what Peter and George envisioned it, this convergence. I think the convergence is really visible in that very session. Thank you.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, just a quick response. So the idea of convergence that George and Peter had talked about, I think in a 2018 paper, is preceded by a period of creolization. And that was discussed yesterday as well. So I think what we see at the moment is a creolized attempt to realize a vision on an infrastructure. And according to the paper from George and Peter, I think we're looking for some sort of sufficiently generalized example that will act as an attractor to further investment and interest and acceptance. So
Okay, thank you. Can I ask, by the way, the second time creolization term has been named. When will pigeonization start? When will we start getting together and
Yeah, may I?
mutual understandability?
So, oh yeah, it's not going to happen anymore. Yeah. So these realizations have also kind of triggered, like, wow, what would it mean to live in a world where there are machine actionable units of information running around that are nanopublication in their form, and other machine actionable units of information running around in maybe even a different specification, but they're both fair. They could interoperate. So it's really kind of re-examining what this looks like. It could be that we end up with a coexistence.
Peaceful, I hope.
Hopeful, yeah, at the center of the hourglass. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at least a lower layer of interoperability for all the different tastes would be good. Sorry to have kept you waiting.
No problem. No problem. This was very interesting. Thanks for that. And good morning also from my side. I'm Stefan Weisgerber. You see, I'm not a scientific or academic guy. I'm a standards guy. Therefore, I will maybe, let's put it that way, provide a talk that is more on a helicopter level. It's pretty much non-technical. And I will try to also give you an impression of things that have been touched on by Peter and Hans-Günther as well, as we are trying or currently are busy putting together a FDO project, reference implementation project in Germany. So, first of all, what's the motivation? What we see in Germany, but also elsewhere, is that we have such trans-organizational data-driven initiatives popping up everywhere. There are, in industry in particular, there are quite some more or less well-known examples like Industry 4.0, Gaia-X, Catena-X, the industrial data space, the digital product passport, which could evolve to a sort of digital twin of everything from development to recycling or dismantling. But also, if you look at smart standards, something that us as DIN is keeping us busy pretty much, which, by the way, reminded me very much of what you talked about, Nanopublications. What is behind there is that we go away from document-centric provision of standards to stripping it down to elements such that you can machine actionably retrieve individual data, individual requirements, etc. from standards. So I think this really calls for FDOs. So, but the question is, as we're seeing all these initiatives and everybody invents his own way of creating data spaces, if you're just moving from analog silos to digital silos, which wouldn't give us much advantage. Maybe it makes things even worse because you have huge but disconnected amounts of data. Therefore, we see a clear need for establishing this famous global integrated data space. And because there is also one point, even if one could live with these islands for the time being, things are changing, and we see it all the time that the boundaries between sectors are being blurred through digitalization. And so the basic idea for what we are setting up right now is to explore, enhance, and demonstrate the ability of FDOs to serve as a basis for this global industrial data, integrated data space, sorry. So what are the objectives? The project shall be set up for 3 years. We first want to demonstrate the functionality and scalability of FDOs as a solid and secure basis of it. We want to, by learning from the experiences, further push the FDO concepts and specifications, making input to all these discussions and works. and we want to base that on some selected use cases I will talk about in a moment from industry and also from applied research. We want to implement what I wrote here, powerful, future-oriented, sustainable and resilient data infrastructure, which shall be based on FDOs. That means basically an industry-grade infrastructure that is really of interest for industry to run operational services on it. Having gained the insights, but it's just not enough. We also want to work on how to transfer that, how to make it available for the broader industry, for broader science, etc. And one well-established way of doing that is doing standardization. And last but not least, power comes from communities, creativity comes from communities. Therefore, it's also about developing a vibrant FDO community that really consists of experts from industry, from science, and also from the public sector. So, and I want to go a little bit into the details, the basic infrastructure. I already mentioned it. It's about creating a industry-grade FDO-based infrastructure. There's Industry 4.0. Many of you may be somewhat familiar with it. It's basically about the digitalization of industrial production. This concept has been established like 10 years ago, and it has very much advanced since then. So it's now really in the labs, in the production plants. So it's being used. It's pretty much developed. There are very advanced concepts like the asset administration shell, which is a sort of digital twin of any asset of whatever kind. And therefore, it's a good showcase and also a study case on how to use FDOs, how FDOs could interact with such concepts, etc. And it's very well suited to take concepts, to take experiences, also requirements that have been developed in really applying that stuff, taking them and develop therefore a set of services, of FDO-based services, which is really generally applicable, which has the power to serve any needs that might be out there. And last point is to really develop an open test lab, which could also serve as a reference implementation. So I missed to start my timers. Therefore, you will keep me updated. Okay. So use cases. And any basic infrastructure should also employ real study cases. And we have foreseen a number of them. The first one, and I think this is very important, this testbed I mentioned, it is supposed to integrate various already existing repositories like GaiaX, etc. And the idea behind this, in the same sense for decades ago, TCP/IP started connecting all the isolated computer networks to demonstrate that an FDO-based inter-data space could, like the internet at that time, could really integrate those repositories. Next one is demonstrate the values of FDOs to serve as a basis for dynamic digital twins. What I mean here in particular is the digital product passport, which is an endeavor at a very high level in the European Union. It's one of the central pillars of the digital transition of the current Commission, so the uppermost strategic level of the European Commission. And we think that FDOs could basically be the concept that can host this digital twin. So we want to explore that. experiences and insights from those testbeds and industrial initiatives should be used to develop such enhanced functionalities. And on top, we also intend to explore the potential and also the potential future evolution of FDOs if we look at future quantum technology-based data spaces. And there are also some other really cutting-edge technologies like cancer databases, medical imaging, and we want to show that FDOs are also a very valuable and powerful tool to really foster research on such stuff. Foundations. What we're about to build, and I think not just we are about to build, what if I look at all the discussions here in the conference is that such concepts related to data become powerful. They create really sort of organism, powerful organism with much interaction and everything. And this could create emerging effects which should be studied also very early, like legal and ethical aspects. Think of AI, and the more data you have, the more powerful AI can become, etc. The philosophy of information, also overall the social impact of digital transformation, and something that has also been touched on, the codification of roles and usage scenarios. There will be more projects, and again, we want to create such a vivid forum. And the last but not least, the transfer. I mentioned that. It's not just important to create such stuff, but also to get it into wide use. I mentioned that standards are a well-proven and powerful instrument to do such transfer. The important thing is, if you look at strategic decisions or large-scale investments, they will only happen if there is transfer in the underlying concepts, in their stability, in their sustainability, etc. And standards are a very powerful means to create that trust. We also have to see that the European regulation that already exists and is forthcoming on data will largely rely on European and also international standards. And this is what is behind the fact that the FDO forum has approached Dean like 12 months ago, and we have created an MOU or concluded an MOU in early 2022. And based on this MOU, we are intending to create or develop a standardization roadmap to create initiatives that direct at the international standardization level. And first steps of that are already taken, and always to underline, the FDO specifications will be at the core of this activity. And to conclude, we need such determined steps towards a GITS now, not only for science and research, but also for industry and administrations. We, as the authors of the underlying abstract, see FDOs as a unique basis to implement that. And we have outlined a 3-year project that will contribute through an exemplary infrastructure to work on concrete high-level use cases, foundational work, and a systematic standardization program. Again, all centered around the FDO forum's work. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. One or two burning questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Wilbert from Panhuis from the NIH in the US, and when these discussions, I'm also think at a conceptual level, I'm quite interested to see that you're going to take this into an implementation plan to actually make a community around this. I'm sure I'll follow very closely how this is going to work out. But one of the questions is that I'm struggling with is a bit, when you present it like that, is there are many stakeholders involved, like partners, repositories, data providers, data users. So can you say a little bit about what the idea is for who is going to do what parts? Are you going to try to convince or get partners on board to implement FDO concepts and technologies in their repositories, in their data structures, in their, or are you as an organization going to try to do a lot of that work so that others can see how well it works, or how are you trying to kind of get people on board with this, and what do they need to do to participate?
Maybe two short points, as time is already. First thing is we already have got some partners, quite a few, that are willing and interested in working on that. And second, an experience that I've made in several conversations with industry people, it takes you just a few sentences to give them an idea of what the potential of FDOs is and to convince them that this is really interesting. So I think finding partners shouldn't be the biggest problem of that story.
Okay, that's good news, I would say. Thank you, Stefan, again.